After the lamps are lowered, the room keeps its quiet shape. The work of medicine is often remembered through discoveries, but it was also made from listening, waiting, measuring, carrying, cleaning, and recording. Tonight, the history stays close to those ordinary details. Before the first X-ray rooms, the bedside was the center of medical life. A patient's condition was gathered from surfaces and small signs: posture, breath, voice, skin, the set of a shoulder, the way a hand rested against a blanket, the pauses between words. The room held a bed, a chair, a basin, folded linen, a notebook, and the patient's time. In that setting, medicine moved at the pace of attention. Nothing was instant. Everything had to be watched, returned to, and understood in sequence. The old bedside world depended on repetition. A visit in the morning did not end the matter. Another visit in the afternoon might change the meaning of what had been seen earlier. A page turned into a memory that the eye alone could not keep. Notes gathered into files, and files turned scattered moments into a longer story. That paper trail mattered because illness was not a single event. It was a process, spread across hours and days, sometimes clear, sometimes stubbornly unclear. Much of that labor was shared. Someone brought water, someone changed the sheets, someone carried a tray, lifted a cup, adjusted a pillow, or drew a curtain when the light became too sharp. Someone emptied a basin and returned with clean cloth. In homes, that work often belonged to family and neighbors. In hospitals, it was divided among attendants, nurses, and physicians. The setting could change, but the basic work remained the same: care for the person, maintain an orderly room, preserve an honest record, and keep watch. This kind of medicine was practical before it was anything else. A sick room needed objects within reach because care was made from small, repeated acts. There had to be a table for papers and instruments, a cabinet for supplies, a place to sit, a way to wash, a way to write, a way to carry things without breaking the quiet. The room became a working space not because it was crowded with equipment, but because every object had a task. The patient's bed was not only a place to rest, it was a place where observation, memory, and judgment came together. Older medicine also lived with delay. The body could not always be open to sight, and the hidden parts had to be approached indirectly. If pain was deep, if a swelling was uncertain, if a fracture was suspected, the answer had to be built from what could be heard, touched, counted, and compared over time. That did not make the work weak, it made the work disciplined. A doctor learned to move from sign to sign, from one clue to another, with patience. The bedside became a place where uncertainty was managed through routine. Then a different kind of seeing entered the story. In 1895, Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen was working in his laboratory with a cathode ray tube when he discovered a new kind of ray. According to the National Library of Medicine's account, it could travel great distances, penetrate solid matter, activate fluorescent screens, and expose photographic plates. That was the startling fact at the beginning. The body could now be traced by something that did not behave like ordinary light. A hidden shape could leave a visible mark without being open to the hand. The discovery did not arrive as a finished hospital practice. It began as an event in a laboratory, a result that had to be understood before it could be used. That matters because medical change often begins at the edge of routine. Someone sees an effect that was not expected. Someone recognizes that a strange result may be useful. Someone realizes that a phenomenon made in one kind of room might answer questions in another. The path from observation to practice is rarely straight. It has to cross through institutions, habits, and the practical demands of care. Hospitals already knew how to organize linen, records, rounds, and meals. They knew how to keep a room quiet and a schedule moving. What they did not yet have was a settled place for a ray that could pass through matter and leave a mark on a plate. A new practice needed a new arrangement of space. Darkness, handling, and careful timing would matter in ways the bedside had not previously required. The discovery therefore asked for more than curiosity. It asked for a room. That request did not erase the older bedside habits. It joined them. A picture on a plate could sharpen a question, but it could not replace the conversation that brought the patient's story into the room. It could show a shape, but not the full human context around that shape. It could confirm a doubt, but it still depended on the routines that gave medicine its continuity. Listening remained important, recording remained important, cleanliness remained important. The new image entered a world already trained to attend to detail. The older culture of care was built from repeated acts that made time legible. Every round of the day returned the same necessities: water, food, linen, cleaning, writing, carrying, and listening. The room kept its rhythm through maintenance. A blanket had to be smoothed. A tray had to be cleared. A note had to be written. A chair had to be moved closer. A lamp had to be lowered. A window had to be opened for air and then closed again. None of that was secondary. It was how a sick room stayed fit for life. The hospital room was practical long before it was technological. It held beds and cabinets, but also a kind of order that made illness easier to follow. Someone came at regular hours. Someone asked the same questions again. Someone compared what was seen today with what had been written yesterday. Repetition was not monotony. Repetition was how change became visible. A fever could rise and fall. A wound could look different by evening. A pulse could tell one story in the morning and another later. The bedside taught medicine to live with time. When X-ray practice began to gather around hospitals, it entered that same order of time. The patient still had to arrive, be prepared, be recorded, and be returned to a familiar network of care. The image might come from a different method, but it still belonged to a system built on paper, attendance, and trust in procedure. A new room would not stand alone. It would depend on schedules, names, files, and the careful movement of people through the institution. The machine would be added to the hospital's existing habits, not dropped in from nowhere. The source of the ray is important here because it shows how medical progress often crosses a boundary between laboratory and ward. Röntgen's discovery came from experimental work, not from the bedside itself. That distance is part of the story. It shows that medicine does not only advance by refining old habits, sometimes it receives something from outside its daily routine, something that must be translated into a new setting. The first X-ray rooms were born from that translation. They were spaces where a laboratory fact was turned into a clinical practice. Before the new images, a great deal of bedside medicine had already been a kind of technology without machinery. The eye, the ear, the hand, the notebook, the habit of comparison, and the discipline of return all made a system of knowing. That system was slower than the ray, but it was not primitive. It was a practiced way of keeping track of a living body over time. X-rays did not remove that inheritance. They extended it. They gave medicine another method for asking where something was and what shape it had, while the older habits continued to provide context and judgment. That is why the first X-ray rooms were not simply rooms with new apparatus. They were rooms in which attention had to be reorganized. The patient still mattered first, but the patient now shared the space with plates, screens, and procedures that required their own care. The room had to support both the human presence and the new kind of evidence. In that sense, the first X-ray room grew out of the sick room rather than replacing it. It kept the old concern for comfort and order while making space for a different way of seeing. The image also changed the value of records. A written note could say that a fracture was suspected, that a swelling was present, or that pain had moved from one place to another. But an image brought another kind of evidence into the file. It could be kept, compared, and shown. This mattered in places where teaching and review depended on what could be preserved and shared. The ledger and the plate began to live side by side. One held language, the other held shadow. Together they altered how certainty was built. The shift was not a clean break, it was a layering. The ward still needed its old rhythm, rooms still needed cleaning, order, and silence. Staff still needed to explain what was happening in words patients could understand. A new tool did not abolish care. It made care more complex. It added another procedure to the day and another kind of object to the room. Hospitals learned to keep more than one way of knowing at once. That was the real change, not replacement, but coexistence. For the people who lived through that change, it could be felt in small things: a darkened space where there had once been only daylight, a plate handled with care, a result that seemed to appear out of ordinary matter, a ray that no one could see, yet one that left a visible trace. None of that canceled the older room. It layered onto it. Medicine kept its bed, its notes, its linens, and its patient waiting in the center, and then learned to make room for another form of evidence. The room became larger in purpose, even if it did not become larger in size. The first X-ray rooms also belonged to institutions that were already built on teaching. Students and younger clinicians learned by standing near the bedside, hearing observations spoken aloud, and seeing how a senior physician moved from sign to judgment. Once radiology entered that world, instruction could include the visible trace of hidden parts. The lesson expanded. It became possible to compare what the hand found with what the plate showed. The ward and the image room began to share authority, and that sharing changed how medical knowledge was passed on. Public trust mattered as well. A new medical tool had to feel usable, explainable, and steady enough to become part of ordinary care. Patients were asked to accept unfamiliar equipment, unfamiliar handling, and unfamiliar darkness, while still relying on the same institution that had cared for them through quieter routines. That trust came from continuity as much as novelty. The same people who changed linen and kept records also helped the new method become familiar. The machine entered through a door that care had already opened. There is something revealing in that sequence. The old bedside habits were not abandoned in order to make room for the ray. They were the ground the new practice stood on. The room still depended on water, paper, cloth, and conversation. It still depended on the steady labor of people who moved quietly around a resting body. Only later did a different kind of sight become normal. The discovery in the laboratory was extraordinary, but the room in which it would matter had to be ordinary first. The record keeping around this change also tells its own story. A file had to keep the patient's name, the day's observations, the explanation, and later, perhaps, the image itself. That meant the old logic of the bedside did not disappear. It became more layered. Notes could be compared with plates. One visit could be read beside another. Teaching could use the image as a reference point, without losing the narrative of care that came from the ward. A new object joined the archive, but the archive itself was already a living part of medicine. Even now, it is worth remembering how much of medicine was made from maintenance. The room had to be ready before any discovery could matter. The linen had to be changed. The surfaces had to be cleaned. The patient had to be settled. The page had to be turned. The lamp had to be lowered. These details do not sound dramatic, but they are the conditions that allow a new method to become useful. Without them, a ray is only a curiosity. With them, it becomes part of practice. By the time Röntgen received the first Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901, the discovery had already moved beyond the laboratory and into the medical imagination. That movement was not just scientific, it was institutional. It asked hospitals to think about space, procedure, and the circulation of information. It asked staff to add one more careful act to the day. It asked patients to enter a room where another kind of looking had become possible. Yet even then, the room remained recognizable. There was still the bed, the chair, the page, the linen, the person waiting, and the quiet labor of making sense of illness in time. So the story begins before the machine, in the older habits that made medicine a bedside craft. The lamps go low, the pen moves across the page, the basin is lifted, the curtain is drawn, and the day's work is assembled from small acts that matter more than they first appear. When the first X-ray rooms begin to take shape, they do not arrive in an empty world. They enter that long practice of care where attention has already been trained to linger, to compare, and to notice what the body gives away slowly. The first X-ray rooms are often less like inventions than like arrangements. A room is borrowed, then cleared, then darkened, and only after that does the new work settle inside it. The old furniture stays useful. A table stands near the wall, a plate waits in its sleeve, wires and stands crowd one corner, and the door closes on a quieter kind of attention. At the center is a small set of objects that do not look like a revolution. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen was studying cathode radiation in a glass tube filled with rarefied gas. The apparatus was hidden from stray light, yet a faint glow appeared on a nearby light-sensitive surface. From that arrangement came an unknown radiation that could pass through ordinary material and leave its trace on photographic plates. The discovery later received the first Nobel Prize in physics, and medicine inherited not a grand machine at first, but a practical problem: how to give that strange trace a room of its own. In the room itself, darkness becomes a tool. Lamps are lowered, windows are covered, anything that might scatter attention is pushed aside. The point is not drama, the point is to make the faintest signal easier to catch. If a screen is used, the eyes must settle into the dimness. If a plate is used, the room must protect it from stray light. The new practice teaches patience in a different register. It is still a room for care, but now care includes the management of illumination and the discipline of letting the room go quiet enough for a trace to appear. The body enters that quiet as an object of arrangement. It is placed, turned, supported, and held still. A shadow only tells the truth when the relation between source, body, and plate is exact enough to be trusted. That gives the room a new geometry. The angle of a limb, the distance to the plate, the steadiness of the person, the firmness of the table, all become part of the medicine. The old bedside craft still matters, but it is joined by another sort of order. The hand that once listened and palpated now also has to align, center, and prepare. Then comes the root. A plate goes in one direction for exposure and another for development. Between those two moments lies a second room, darker still, where the plate can be handled, washed, and marked. This root matters as much as the exposure itself. Without it, the trace remains only potential. With it, the room produces an image that can be kept. The dark room becomes a companion space, and the passage between rooms turns the work into a sequence rather than a single act. In that sequence, the image is not discovered all at once. It is coaxed into view, step by careful step. Once the plate is developed, the room's work changes from seeing to keeping. A result is not just looked at, it is labeled, stored, and compared. The name on the envelope matters. So does the date, the case, the repeat exposure, the later return to the same patient. Over time, the room begins to build a collection, not a decorative collection, but a working one, a cabinet of plates, negatives, prints, and notes that can be opened again when memory has thinned. The image becomes a record that travels farther than the patient's own memory, and that gives radiology one of its first lasting habits. Hospitals and clinics moved quickly because the method offered something medicine had wanted for a long time: a way to look at the interior without opening it. The exact room varied from place to place. Sometimes it was a borrowed laboratory corner. Sometimes it was a room near surgery. Sometimes it was a temporary setup that became permanent because no one wanted to give it back once it proved useful. The speed of adoption did not mean stability. Early radiology was still finding its shape, yet the room was already doing the work of an institution. It gathered people, objects, and records into one practice, and that practice began to earn its own place on the hospital floor. From the ward's point of view, the X-ray room changed the day's route. A person left a bed or a waiting chair, crossed into a different kind of hush, and came back with a result rather than only a conversation. The journey mattered because the institution was learning to move bodies and papers together. One corridor led to another, one label matched another. A case became traceable. That traceability was part of the new order. It allowed radiography to fit into hospital life without becoming a spectacle. That place was shared by different kinds of workers. Physicians brought clinical questions. Physicists brought an understanding of the tube and the current. Photographers understood plates, development, and the handling of fragile images. Nurses and assistants kept order, steadied the person in the room, and moved materials between spaces. Engineers repaired, adjusted, and built. Before radiology settled into a distinct specialty, it was a meeting ground for several trades. The room made that mix possible because the room itself required many skills at once. It needed clinical judgment, mechanical patience, and a careful hand with paper, glass, and light. Time in the room was different from time at the bedside. There was the waiting before exposure, the short stillness during it, and the longer pause while the plate was developed. A small delay could alter the result. A shift in position could blur the trace. Too much stray light could spoil the plate before it spoke. So the room trained everyone in a measured pace. This was not a leisurely pace. It was an exact one. The work moved when it had to move, and it held still when stillness mattered. The routine created a rhythm that medicine could repeat, and repetition is what lets a novelty become a method. The image itself did not end uncertainty, but it changed the form of uncertainty. What had been inferred from touch or complaint could now be compared with a shadow on a plate. The body was no longer only described, it was also recorded. That brought a new kind of responsibility to the room, because a record invites interpretation, and interpretation asks for training. A shadow can mislead if it is read too quickly. The room therefore became a place where the eye had to learn a new language. Bones, gaps, alignments, and hidden shapes became part of a written and seen grammar that had to be taught. The early years also taught that every new method brings limits of its own. The ray was powerful, and its effects were not fully understood at first. The room would eventually have to carry more caution, better habits, and stronger boundaries. That future is still ahead in the story. But even here, the need for care is visible. The apparatus is not enough by itself. The room must be managed. The route must be clear. The plate must be handled correctly. The work only looks effortless after a long chain of exact actions has already been completed. Once a room can make dependable records, it becomes a place of teaching. An image can be shown to students, held beside other cases, and used to explain what a hand, a chest, a joint, or a bone is doing beneath the surface. The collection of plates slowly becomes a collection of examples. A single room can then serve many people who were not present when the exposure was made. That is one of the quiet changes brought by radiology. The patient's case can outlive the appointment and still remain useful. The room is no longer only a site of service, it is also a site of memory and instruction. Over time, the collection itself grows plain and dependable. Not every plate is memorable in isolation. Many are simply useful. Yet together, they form a ledger of the ordinary work of care. A limb, a chest, a joint, a repeat, a correction, a follow-up. The power of the collection lies in accumulation. No single plate carries the whole meaning. The pile does, the shelf does, the box does. Medicine learns, through the room, how to let many small records speak together. That shift matters because hospitals are not only rooms, they are systems of movement, paper, responsibility, and shared trust. The X-ray room adds another layer to that system. It needs appointments, or at least turns. It needs storage. It needs labels that do not fall off. It needs someone to know where yesterday's result went. Soon enough, the room ceases to be an odd experiment on the edge of medicine and becomes part of ordinary workflow. The novelty fades, but the routine remains. A familiar path opens from the ward or clinic to the imaging room, then to the development space. then to the shelf or file cabinet. The wider line of radiology keeps growing after that. The same broad ambition that began with X-rays later reaches ultrasound, nuclear magnetic resonance, PET, Connecticut, and MRI. Each new method changes the tools. Each one also preserves the older promise to learn something about the body without relying only on touch or opening. The first X-ray room does not know those later names, but it makes their arrival easier to imagine. It gives medicine a habit worth keeping, the habit of setting aside a room for what cannot be seen directly and then building a reliable route toward it. Even so, the history stays concrete. The room still depends on ordinary things. A cabinet keeps the plates in order. A tray carries a fresh plate in and a developed one out. A ledger holds the case list. A cloth or cover keeps stray light at bay. A table supports the body. A door closes with a practical purpose. The new work survives by leaning on these small articles and on the people who remember how to return each thing to its place. This is why the first X-ray rooms feel so human in retrospect. They are not only about discovery, they are about tidiness, repetition, and the willingness to make a space that can be used again tomorrow. In the end, the room is the lesson. The object is the ray and the plate, but the room gives them a life in medicine. The routine turns a laboratory event into an institutional practice. From there, the method can travel into records, teaching, and broader hospital work. What begins as a faint glow on a light-sensitive surface becomes a way of organizing care around evidence that can be carried, stored, and read again. The first X-ray rooms were simple in furniture and vast in consequence. They made a new kind of trace, and then they learned how to keep it. The room begins to look less like a novelty and more like a workshop. In the first years after Röntgen's discovery in 1895, the important thing was not grandeur, it was arrangement. A room had to be dark enough for plates, open enough for a table, quiet enough for patients, and plain enough that no one confused the apparatus with magic. The cathode ray tube belonged with the wires and the coils. The body, or the part of it being studied, belonged on the table. The plate belonged close by, waiting for the brief exposure that would turn an invisible passage into a visible trace. Everything in the room served that transfer. A screen, a lamp, a notebook, a clock, a drawer for labeled plates. These were small objects, but they gave the process a repeatable shape. And once the picture was made, the work did not stop. The plate had to be carried to the darkroom, developed, fixed, washed, dried, and marked. The image needed a name, a date, a body part, a reason. If the first attempt was blurred or too faint, the room made room for another attempt. That is where the routine became a discipline. Exposure times were adjusted, subjects were repositioned, notes were kept. One image was compared with the next. The room taught restraint as much as curiosity, because every step left a record that could be checked, repeated, and discussed. The new site was not only a revelation, it was a procedure. Soon the room was no longer only a laboratory corner. Hospitals began to recognize that the image had uses beyond astonishment. Surgeons wanted a guide before they cut. Physicians wanted a trace they could keep against memory. Teachers wanted plates they could show to students. Administrators wanted a service with regular hours, labeled files, and someone responsible for the tools. So the X-ray room became a department in waiting. It asked for order, shelves for plates, folders for reports, space for consultation, and a habit of returning each object to the same place. The new specialty grew out of that habit. Radiology was not only a theory of seeing, it was a way of organizing work around sight. The consequences spread outward from the room into the larger hospital. Once an image could be stored, it could be reviewed later, compared with another, or brought to a meeting where several minds looked at the same evidence. Once the image could be filed, it could enter the history of a case. Once the room could make its own routine, the routine could be taught. That is how a discovery becomes an institution. The chamber that once held a single tube and a plate begins to resemble every later imaging suite in its own modest way, a controlled space, a dependable sequence, a record that outlives the immediate event. Even the later arc of radiology points back to that first logic. Ultrasound, nuclear magnetic resonance, PT, Connecticut, MRI, each in its own way, inherits the same promise. If the room is ready and the procedure is kept, the body will leave behind a trace that can be read again. The first X-ray rooms taught medicine that visibility could be made ordinary, and that ordinariness was its own kind of power. In the room, beyond the room, the work changed hands. The X-ray table mattered, but so did the sink with its shallow basin, the shelf of envelopes, the rack for drying plates, and the ledger opened under a small lamp. The first radiology rooms were never only places where a ray crossed a body. They were places where one person handed a task to another and another, until the image, the name, and the note all arrived in the same order. That order was the real furniture of the place. Without it, the room was only a device in an empty shell. The new practice borrowed from older trades. A photographer knew plates and chemicals. An electrician knew currents, switches, and the moods of a machine. A nurse knew how to settle a frightened patient and how to keep a difficult posture for long enough to matter. A clerk knew the difference between a loose paper and a record that might be needed again. Early X-ray work asked for all of them at once. The title for the person doing the work came later than the work itself. At the beginning, the room was a bundle of tasks gathered around a humming apparatus. A patient did not arrive in the room alone. The visit had already passed through a ward, a corridor, a call slip, a name written on a paper tag, and a choice about which body part needed attention. Someone had to move the patient, someone had to position the limbs or the back or the chest, and someone had to remember which plate belonged to which body and which day. The route mattered because every room in the circuit depended on the one before it. A mislabeled envelope could spoil the whole sequence. A forgotten request could send the wrong person back into the hall. The work was small and exacting, and it lived in those handoffs. In the dark room, the labor was quieter but no less precise. Plates had to be carried in, changed, washed, fixed, and dried without confusion. Trays had to stay in their places. A wet surface had to stay clean. A label had to survive the trip from the examination room to the shelf. The room smelled of chemicals and damp paper, and the sink became as important as the machine next door. One helper watched the clock, another watched the sequence of trays, another checked whether a mark on the plate really belonged to the image or to a careless touch. The room did not forgive hesitation, but it also did not reward haste. It asked for patience every time. There were few settled instructions at first. So much of the craft traveled by observation. A person stood near an experienced worker and repeated the same motions until the order felt natural: when to lower the plate, when to steady the tube, when to call for the next subject, when to stop and look again. Small errors were common. An image could come out blurred, too pale, too dark, or uselessly shifted. A label could be put on the wrong envelope. A plate could be exposed and then lost in the shuffle of the desk. Those failures did not make the work trivial. They showed how much had to be learned before the room could produce anything reliable at all. Nurses and attendants carried a different part of the burden. They spoke to the patient before the apparatus did. They arranged pillows and cloths, helped with clothing, supported a limb, and kept the body still while the room did its own work. They also had to read the mood of the room. A patient who had never seen such a machine might pull away from the unfamiliar stand or flinch at the stillness that the image required. The nurse's hand, the orderly's patience, and the steady tone of the person at the side of the table made the procedure possible long before the plate was developed. Much of that labor left no mark on the final image, but it shaped whether there would be an image at all. Women carried a great deal of that early technician work, even when the records of the time made them easy to overlook. In many places, the room depended on women who learned the sequence, handled the equipment, and kept the routine moving. Their work sat at the meeting point of care and technique. It asked for steadiness, memory, and a practical eye. It also asked for endurance. The labor was often treated as support rather than authorship, as if the image had risen from the apparatus by itself. But the room knew otherwise. It knew which person had laid out the plates, which person had adjusted the patient, which person had kept the notes straight, and which person had made the next attempt possible. The machine itself drew in another set of workers. Electricians checked connections, repaired faults, and kept the current where it needed to be. Mechanics tightened loose parts, replaced worn pieces, and listened for a sound that meant the apparatus was not behaving as it should. In those early rooms, a machine that failed could stall the whole day. It was not enough for the tube to exist. It had to be made ready, watched, and trusted. The people who understood the wiring and the joints were as necessary as the people who understood the body. Their labor was not dramatic. It was the kind of labor that disappears when it works and becomes obvious only when it stops. Photography remained present even when no one named it. The darkroom tray, the drying rack, the careful handling of a plate, the insistence on keeping one image separate from another, all of it belonged to photographic practice as much as to medicine. A patient's body moved through the room, but the plate moved through a different kind of discipline. It had to be protected from stray light, from fingerprints, from confusion. Someone had to clean the tools and return them to their places. Someone had to know when a bath had gone stale or when a plate no longer deserved another use. These were ordinary chores, yet the room depended on them as surely as it depended on the tube and the table. The record room made the labor last. A name written in a notebook, a date on a folder, a body part noted beside a request, a plate enclosed in a paper sleeve, a report placed in a file drawer. These things turned a single exposure into part of a larger memory. Without paper, the image would have been only a brief event. With paper, it could be found again, compared, carried to another desk, or matched against a later visit. The clerks and assistants who kept those papers in order performed a kind of memory work that was easy to miss. They made the room legible to the hospital. They made the image useful after the light had gone out. That usefulness depended on repetition. The room could not be improvised from scratch every time. It settled into habits, the way a name was called, the way a plate was marked, the way a request moved from hand to hand, the way a report returned to the ward. A newer worker learned by standing behind an older one and copying the sequence. That is how a craft becomes a craft. Not by a single brilliant gesture, but by a series of corrected motions that slowly harden into shared practice. The room taught through repetition. It taught which shelf held the clean plates, which drawer held the forms, which corner stayed dry, and which questions had to be answered before the next patient entered. Over time, those repeated motions made room for a specialty. What had begun as a cluster of tasks around a new device became a department with its own rhythms. Titles appeared, schedules appeared. People began to speak of the work as a field rather than a side effort. That shift mattered because it gave the labor a place inside the hospital instead of leaving it in the margins. It also made training more visible. A person no longer had to learn entirely by accident or by borrowing a few hours from another trade. The room could now teach its own habits. It could pass on the way a plate was handled, the way a request was checked, the way the darkroom and the examination room had to agree with each other. The work, though, remained tiring. It asked people to stand for long stretches, to bend over equipment, to wait in half-light, to repeat the same motion again after a failed attempt, and to keep attention steady while the room stayed quiet. The labor was physical even when it looked technical. It also carried risk. The first workers did not yet live inside a mature culture of caution, and the room could be unforgiving to those who spent too many hours beside it. That history sits behind the later seriousness of the field. A practice built on seeing through matter also had to learn, at cost, that the people doing the seeing were part of the same story. Failures gave the room its discipline. A blurred image meant a patient might need to wait while the steps were repeated. A plate that came out too dark meant more time in the darkroom. A mislabeled envelope meant questions at the desk and perhaps a second round of work for everyone involved. There was no glamour in that repetition, only responsibility. Yet it is often in those repeated corrections that a new practice earns trust. The room became dependable because the people inside it did not treat failure as the end of the matter. They treated it as a sign that the sequence had to be checked again. The method was as important as the result, and the method lived in the hands of the workers. The physician's desk sat at the far edge of that sequence. An image came there after the patient had left the room, after the plate had been processed, after the labels had been checked, after the paper trail had been set right. The interpretation was only one part of the story. The work behind it included the person who positioned the patient, the person who maintained the machine, the person who developed the plate, and the person who filed the result. What looked like one act of observation was actually a chain of labor. The image carried authority, partly because so many people had already handled it with care. Even the quiet confidence of a report depended on a long line of practical tasks that kept it honest. This is why the early X-ray room mattered as a workplace as much as a scientific site. It gathered people who might otherwise never have worked side by side. It asked them to speak in short, useful sentences, to pass objects cleanly, to trust the order of the room, and to accept that no single pair of hands could do the whole thing. A patient's visit moved through a small community. The community's labor disappeared into the final print, but the print was built from that disappearing labor. The room became ordinary only because many people made it so. The device could not have turned medicine toward visible proof on its own. It needed the people who kept arriving, opening drawers, checking names, and returning the plates to the shelf. In the file cabinet, those plates began to behave like a collection. One drawer held one kind of case, another drawer held a different kind, and a careful hand could compare them without reopening the room itself. That was one reason the work became teachable. The image no longer lived only in the moment of exposure. It could be reviewed, stacked, matched, and returned to the shelf as evidence of how the procedure had been done. The cabinet and the notebook together gave the room a memory longer than a single appointment. They also made the workers accountable to one another, because the record could be checked after the fact. The corridor outside the room mattered almost as much as the room itself. That was where patients waited, where orderlies carried messages, where a physician asked for one more plate, and where a nurse learned that the next case had been delayed. The whole department depended on that passage. It carried sound, paper, and responsibility from one doorway to another. If the corridor was crowded, the day slowed. If the forms were clear, the day moved. The people who worked there became experts in that traffic. They knew when to step aside, when to call the next name, when to put a fresh sheet on the table, and when to keep the line moving without making a patient feel hurried. What remained after all that motion was not only an image, it was a habit of cooperation. A room had taught medicine to depend on more than a single brilliant observer. It had taught it to depend on orderly hands, patient repetition, and records that could be found later in a drawer. That habit spread quietly. It made the practice sturdier, and it made the workers harder to ignore, even when their names stayed out of the headline of the moment. The work was carried by many people because it could only survive that way. In the soft light of the room, that was the fact that mattered most. Even after the appointment ended, the paper and the plate stayed tied together in memory. A later doctor could open the drawer, compare one print with another, and see how the department had learned to keep its promises. That was the deeper change. The work no longer vanished after the patient left. It could be stored, compared, and taught. The room had turned passing labor into something durable enough to become part of the hospital's ordinary life. The drawer was only a resting place. The real discipline sat in the objects around it. Plate boxes lined up on a shelf, paper envelopes folded tight around each plate, labels written before the exposure so nothing would be lost when the light was gone. Once the image could be kept, every other detail had to learn restraint. A plate could not be handled carelessly, a label could not be smeared, a box could not be left open to stray light. The hospital learned that an invisible picture still depended on ordinary things, and ordinary things could fail. That dependence reached beyond one drawer. It pulled another room into the work, the dim space where the exposed plate was carried for development. The route between table and darkroom mattered as much as the exposure itself. A plate moved from one set of hands to another, then into chemical trays, then to the rinse water, then to a drying rack or a cabinet. The picture existed only because the room kept the sequence straight. If the order slipped, the record blurred or vanished. The new practice was not just seeing through the body, it was moving materials without breaking their memory. The machine side had its own furniture, a tube, a power source, wires, clamps, and the stand that kept everything in place made the picture possible. The room was no longer a blank chamber. It was a working arrangement of glass and metal. Something had to give the tube enough force. Something had to keep the tube steady. Something had to support the plate at the correct distance. And something had to prevent the whole business from wandering by a fraction while the exposure was underway. The early X-ray room was full of exacting objects that did not look impressive by themselves. Together, they turned electricity into an image. Light had to be managed with the same care. The discovery began in a laboratory tube, a fluorescent screen, and the recognition that the new rays could pass through solid matter, wake a screen, and leave a mark on a photographic plate. The room that followed borrowed that lesson and sharpened it. Daylight, lamp glow, and careless reflections could spoil a plate before the real work had even begun. Cloth, cardboard, paper wrapping, and closed drawers became part of the technique. Darkness was not romantic in that room. It was practical. It kept the plate honest. The body, or specimen, had to be set in a stable relation to the plate. The staff measured distance without a ruler of certainty. They used the room itself as their scale. A hand placed too high, a limb angled badly, a plate shifted a little to one side, and the shadow came back stretched or cut off. Stillness mattered. Timing mattered. Even the smallest movement could write itself into the image. The room asked for patience because the picture was built from waiting as much as from electricity. Every successful exposure was a small agreement among body, plate, and tube. The limits showed themselves at once. The new image did not give depth the way the eye knew depth, and it did not give warmth, texture, or pain. It gave contrast. Dense matter stood out. Metal answered differently than flesh. Bone declared itself more clearly than soft tissue. Yet even that clarity came with a cost. The picture was flat, and flatness made relationships hard to judge. Two structures could overlap and look like one. A shadow could hide behind another shadow. The room could reveal, but only within its own boundaries. That is why the earliest work depended on a kind of disciplined reading. A single plate was not the whole case. The staff compared one image against another, sometimes from a different angle, sometimes from a different day, sometimes simply against the memory of what the body had looked like before. The drawers and folders mattered because comparison lived there. The file kept the history in order. An image with no label was only a stray shadow. An image with a label became part of a story that could be reopened later. The record turned a brief exposure into a durable fact. The ledger on the desk carried as much importance as the tube on the stand. It kept names, dates, parts examined, and the result of the sitting. It told the department which plate belonged to which body and which attempt belonged to which problem. The notebook looked plain, but it protected the work from confusion. If the plate was an image, the ledger was its address. In a busy room that mattered, one case could wait while another was exposed. One plate could be drying while another was being prepared. One memory could fade while the paper remained. The habit of writing things down gave the new practice a spine. Measurement also meant accepting failure. Some plates came out too light. Some came out too dark. Some were fogged before they were developed. Some were spoiled by a leak of light, a loose wrap, a dirty tray, or a restless body. The room taught the staff to look for causes instead of treating every bad plate as mystery. If the exposure failed, the note had to explain why. If the exposure succeeded, the note had to be plain enough to repeat. In that way, the early X-ray room became a workshop of correction. It did not simply produce wonders, it produced habits. The materials themselves had a quiet hierarchy. Glass kept the image, paper guarded it, cardboard blocked stray light, cloth softened the edges of the room, metal carried the current, wood kept the table steady, chemicals brought the hidden pattern forward. None of these items belonged only to medicine. They came from photography, from the laboratory, from cabinet work, from ordinary storage. That mixture gave the first X-ray rooms their particular look. They were not built from one grand invention. They were assembled from familiar things placed under a new demand. That demand changed the way people thought about time. A case could no longer be answered by touch alone, or by a quick glance. The plate asked for a pause, and the pause had to be long enough for the ray to do its work, but short enough to keep the image from washing out. Even without naming a number, the room lived under a threshold. Too little exposure, and nothing appeared. Too much, and the plate lost nuance or became difficult to read. The staff worked in a narrow band between absence and excess. The room was always listening for the place where the image would arrive without being ruined. That narrow band explains why the early rooms valued consistency so highly. A plate holder in the same place, a table at the same height, a tube at the same distance, a screen kept in the same condition, a dark curtain shut the same way each time. Repetition was not boredom, it was calibration. When the room could reproduce its own conditions, the image became trustworthy. And when it could not, the staff had to begin again. The new science made patience into a professional skill. It gave dignity to the small acts that made one exposure match the next. The people working there had to learn the difference between what the plate promised and what it could not promise. A bright mark did not explain itself. A white patch did not always mean the same thing from one case to the next. The image was exact about contrast and silent about meaning. That silence is part of its history. It pushed the eye back to the body, back to the record, back to the question that had brought the person into the room. The plate could point, but it could not conclude. Judgment still belonged to human hands and human eyes. By 1901, the discovery had won the first Nobel Prize in physics, but that honor did not change the feel of the room. The same shelves still kept their paper envelopes. The same trays still needed rinsing. The same careful writing still marked each plate before it disappeared into the file. Recognition came from outside. Routine came from inside. The prestige of the discovery did not remove the need for clean sleeves, steady timing, and orderly storage. Those were the things that let the new method live long enough to matter. That humility is part of why the early X-ray room spread so quickly. It did not ask the hospital to abandon its older disciplines. It asked those disciplines to meet. Physics had to keep steady. Photography had to keep faith with the plate. Nursing hands had to keep the body still. Clerks had to label the result. Orderlies had to move objects in and out without confusion. Surgery, chemistry, bookkeeping, and patient care all met inside a single workflow. The room made those separate crafts answer to the same exposure. As the months and years passed, the meaning of the image widened. A plate could be filed, compared, discussed, and carried to another desk. A teacher could place one beside another and show what changed. A surgeon could look at a shadow before opening a body. A department could keep a record of its own learning. Yet even as the room gained authority, the old limits stayed in place. The image was still only as good as the materials that carried it and the measurements that formed it. The room was powerful because it knew where it stopped. That boundary mattered for trust. Hospitals and patients could see that the picture had been made with ordinary objects handled in order, not with mystery alone. A wrapped plate, a named ledger entry, a clean tray, a controlled light, a body kept still for the interval of exposure. Each detail said that the result had come from care rather than from chance. The early X-ray room therefore did two kinds of work at once. It revealed hidden things, and it taught the institution how to trust a result. The second task may have been the more lasting one. From that point, the room was ready to become part of everyday medicine, not because it had escaped its limits, but because it had learned to live within them. In that way, the first X-ray room became more than a place where a plate was exposed. It became a place where medicine learned a discipline. The room taught people to wait for the right interval, to call each object by name, to keep track of the source, the plate, the exposure, and the result, and to compare one image with the next. The image no longer lived only in the moment of surprise. It could be stored, discussed, and brought back into the conversation when the patient returned. That was a modest change on paper, but a large one in practice, because a department that can keep its own records can also keep its own standards. Roentgen's discovery in 1895 mattered because it showed that a cathode ray tube could create a new kind of ray, one that could travel far, pass through solid matter, light a fluorescent screen, and expose a photographic plate. The first Nobel Prize in Physics, awarded to him in 1901, marked the moment when the new sight became part of the established sciences. But the prize did not close the story. It opened a habit. Once the body could be pictured without opening it, hospitals began to ask which other questions might be answered in similarly careful ways. The next developments followed the pressure of those questions. X-rays were excellent at outlining bone and finding contrast, but they did not solve every problem of depth, motion, or function. A flat shadow could suggest a great deal and still leave something out. So other methods appeared, each one answering a different limit. In 1942, Carl Theodor Dussek first applied ultrasound to medicine. In 1952, Felix Bloch and Edward Purcell developed nuclear magnetic resonance, and later the technique was renamed magnetic resonance imaging because the older name sounded too close to atomic radiation. In 1973, Michael E. Phelps and Edward J. Hoffman developed PET scanning. In 1979, Alan Cormack and Godfrey Hounsfield advanced computed tomography. In 2003, Paul Lauterbur and Peter Mansfield were recognized for the pioneering work that led to the application of magnetic resonance in medical imaging. The names changed, the instruments changed, and the bodies became more familiar to themselves through each new method, but the old pattern remained: a controlled system, a measured output, a result that had to be read with care. That pattern is what the first X-ray room taught best. The room was not just a chamber for revelation, it was a chamber for procedure. Light had to be controlled, plates had to be handled in order, exposure had to be timed. The body had to be placed still enough to make a legible trace. Then the trace had to be compared with what had been asked of it. If the image was too faint, too blurred, or too partial, the fault could be traced back through the steps. The room therefore trained the institution to think in sequences rather than miracles. It suggested that a trustworthy image was the result of many small duties done in the right order. That habit spread outward. A physician could ask for a view, a technician could produce it, a record could be filed, and a later physician could return to it without starting from nothing. In that sense, radiology became part of the hospital's memory. It allowed a case to outlive a single consultation. It let an image become a reference point rather than a fleeting event. Once that happened, the room stopped being extraordinary in the same way. It did not become ordinary because it was simple. It became ordinary because its work could be repeated, checked, and trusted, and still, the limits remained visible. Every new method in radiology carried its own boundary with it, its own way of seeing and not seeing. That was not a weakness to be hidden. It was the condition that made the method honest. The first X-ray room had already shown that medicine could gain power without pretending to know everything. It could use measured materials to reach inside the body, then stop where the method stopped and call that stop by its proper name. That restraint was part of the achievement. It made the image useful, it made the department believable, and it left the door open for the next room, and the next, and the next, each one built not on the illusion of total vision, but on the quieter promise that the body could be studied one careful measurement at a time. That restraint did not stay inside the laboratory. Once the new rays entered the hospital, they had to make peace with the ordinary day. The bell at the desk, the linen cart in the corridor, the patient waiting with a folded paper in hand, the nurse checking a name twice before sending anyone farther down the hall. The discovery had been remarkable because it could pass through solid matter and leave a trace on a plate. In the hospital, that same fact had to become dependable, scheduled, and useful. It had to fit beside beds, wards, surgical cases, and the practical question that every institution asks in its own way: where does this belong, and who is responsible for it? At first, the answer was often a room that had to be made useful before it could be called proper. A hospital did not need a shrine to novelty. It needed a space that could be darkened, kept in order, and reached without confusion from the wards and the operating rooms. The machine, the table, the plate holder, the switch, the draped window, the chemical tray, and the shelf for clean envelopes all had to live somewhere. The room could not be too far from the rest of the hospital because the work it served was not decorative. It was tied to fracture cases, to questions before an operation, to patients whose stories had become difficult to read by hand alone. The new room became a practical answer to a practical problem. That room also changed the map of movement inside the hospital. A patient no longer moved only from bed to consultation and back again. Now there was another route to follow: ward to corridor, corridor to examination room to dark place to desk, desk to chart, chart back to the ward or the surgeon's office. A porter might carry a chair or a stretcher. A nurse might carry the note that explained why the image was wanted. A doctor might come in a few minutes later to look at the result. The process was not just a matter of shining a ray and waiting. It was a chain of hands, doors, paper, and timing. Hospitals learned that the work of seeing inside the body also required the work of moving bodies carefully through the building. The paper trail became its own kind of instrument. A request slip could be small enough to fit in a coat pocket, but it carried authority. It said why the study was being asked for, from where the patient had come, and sometimes what question the ward was trying to settle. That paper had to be read, filed, and matched to the right plate. A register beside the wall could track the day's work in plain lines: name, date, reason, result, return. The language was dry, but the effect was not. For the first time, a hospital could collect these examinations as a body of cases instead of as scattered events. A chart note, a plate envelope, and a ledger entry could belong to the same patient story. The room did not merely produce pictures. It produced records that could be carried from one department to another without losing their place. The dark room gave the work its own rhythm. In that part of the hospital, light was not absent so much as controlled. Trays of liquid, cloths for drying, hooks for hanging, envelopes for keeping plates in order, and shelves for chemical supplies made the room feel like a workshop built around patients. A wet plate could not be rushed. It had to be developed, fixed, washed, and set aside with care. If the hospital had a stack of plates and a steady hand for the chemical steps, the machine became more reliable. If the room was careless, the result could be fogged, blurred, or wasted. That mattered because every plate cost money, and every repeat examination cost time, attention, and trust. The hospital began to understand that this new method was not only about what could be seen, it was also about what had to be controlled if the seeing was to mean anything. That control slowly changed the habits of surgery. Before the image was available, the surgeon relied on touch, experience, and the story told by the patient and the ward staff. The image did not erase those things. It answered them unevenly, and sometimes it argued with them. But it introduced a new pause before action. A broken bone could be looked at before it was handled. A hidden distortion could be considered before a wound was opened. A decision that once depended entirely on the hand and the eye now had another witness. In the hospital, that changed confidence. It did not produce perfect certainty, and it did not remove judgment from the room. It made judgment slower in the best way. It asked the staff to look once more before acting, and that second look altered practice far beyond the room where the plate had been made. The outpatient corridor changed too. The X-ray room was not only for emergencies or for the operating table. People came in from outside the wards, carrying the hospital's growing reputation for a kind of seeing that had not existed before. Some arrived with a broken limb, some with a stubborn pain, some with a question that had outlasted several ordinary examinations. The hospital became a place where an image could be ordered, waited for, and then taken back to the doctor who had asked for it. That waiting mattered. It taught patients that the hospital was no longer only a place for listening and touching. It was also a place where evidence could be made, carried, and returned. The hospital's authority grew partly because the new room made its conclusions feel less like guesswork and more like an account that could be checked. Inside the building, the people who handled the work began to settle into roles that were no longer accidental. Someone had to prepare the room. Someone had to keep the plates in order. Someone had to mix the chemicals. Someone had to make sure the apparatus was ready when the next request arrived. In the earliest years, the same task might have been shared by doctors, photographers, engineers, nurses, and hospital assistants, each bringing a different habit of work. Over time, the hospital started to value not just the machine, but the person who knew its temper. A room like that does not run on wonder, it runs on repetition. The staff who learned its repetitions became part of the institution's memory. They knew which plates failed in damp weather, which corners of the room collected dust, which drawer held fresh envelopes, and how quickly a note had to travel if the patient was already on the move. Administration had its own opinion about all this. A hospital that had once measured itself mainly by beds, meals, laundry, and operations now had to account for a service that required electricity, replacements, chemicals, upkeep, and trained hands. The X-ray room was useful, but it was also needy. It asked for materials that did not last forever. It asked for space that could not easily be shared. It asked for decisions about who controlled the schedule and who signed the book. These are not glamorous questions, but hospitals are built from exactly this kind of question. A new method becomes real when it can be budgeted, maintained, and assigned. The X-ray room forced the hospital to treat radiology not as an afterthought, but as a regular part of its daily machinery. The collection of plates became another sign that practice was changing. A hospital did not keep every image, but it kept enough to show that the work was adding up. Plates and prints could be sorted into boxes, labeled by case, and stored for later teaching or comparison. A shelf of envelopes could become a quiet archive of the institution's own curiosity. These stored images were not trophies, they were examples. They let the staff review a case after the patient had gone, compare one injury with another, or show a student what had been seen. The hospital began to build a memory that lived in paper, glass, and film as much as in the heads of senior staff. That mattered because medical work, especially in a growing hospital, depends on being able to say not only what is happening now, but what happened before and how the building learned from it. Teaching changed along with the records. Once the plates were being kept, they could be used in instruction. A student or junior doctor could stand with a senior physician and look at the same image, then look back at the patient's notes and learn how the visible and the invisible were being joined in one decision. The X-ray room made a hospital more than a place of treatment. It made it a place of argument, demonstration, and comparison. Cases could be gathered and reviewed. The staff could point from one shadow to another, from one edge to another, from one plate to the next, without relying on memory alone. That was a practical change, but it was also an intellectual one. It encouraged the hospital to treat medicine as something that could be taught through repeated examples rather than only through private apprenticeship and occasional dramatic success. The room also helped define the boundary between ordinary care and specialized care. Not every ward had to know how the machine worked, but every ward had to know how to send a patient to it. That difference mattered. It meant the hospital was becoming a network of services rather than a single undivided floor. There were places for rest, places for surgery, places for washing, places for records, and now places for imaging. Each had its own rhythm, yet each depended on the others. The X-ray room did not sit apart from the hospital like an ornament. It pressed the hospital toward specialization. It taught administrators, nurses, doctors, and clerks that modern care would require more than one kind of room and more than one kind of attention. At the same time, the new practice had limits that the staff could not ignore. The image could clarify a fracture line or show a shadow that mattered, but it could not explain everything. It did not replace listening. It did not cancel the physical examination. It did not turn the patient into a simple answer on a plate. The hospital learned, sometimes slowly, that the image was most useful when it remained one part of a larger judgment. That was a serious lesson, because institutions can become dazzled by their own tools. The better hospitals resisted that temptation. They treated the X-ray room as a disciplined helper, not a final oracle. The method earned trust precisely because it could show what it showed and leave the rest to the people who had to interpret it. As the days repeated, the room became ordinary in the best sense of the word. The same envelope, the same table, the same tray, the same names in the book, the same careful return of plates to chart and shelf. Nothing in that routine was small. A hospital is changed as much by its steady habits as by its celebrated discoveries. The X-ray room introduced a new kind of order into the building. It made the institution slower, where slowness was useful, and quicker, where delay had once been costly. It asked for paper, water, linen, shelves, cabinets, and trained hands. And it gave back a way to study the body without opening it. By then, the hospital was no longer adjusting to a strange visitor. It had made space for the room, and the room had made space for a new practice, one careful measurement at a time. And that new order reached beyond the walls of the room. What had begun with Röntgen's discovery of a ray that could pass through solid matter and expose a photographic plate now lived inside the hospital as daily routine. It changed how the hospital remembered a case. A shadow on a plate had to be named, dated, and filed, because the picture only mattered if it could be found again. The envelope went into a drawer, the drawer into a cabinet, and the cabinet into the everyday machinery of the institution. What had once been a fleeting glance became a record that could travel from ward to ward or sit quietly until a surgeon wanted to compare one day with another. The room also changed the pace of consultation. Instead of relying only on a patient's account and the feel of a swollen joint or a tender abdomen, doctors could gather around a visible trace and speak about the same thing. That made disagreement more exact. It also made agreement more useful. A fracture line, a lodged object, a stone, or a clear gap where bone should have crossed could be pointed out, discussed, and checked again. The image did not replace judgment. It gave judgment a surface to work on. As the work settled in, the hospital had to assign it a place. Someone had to request the examination, bring the patient, arrange the tube and plate, carry the exposed film to the darkroom, wash and dry the result, and return it to the chart. Someone had to keep the supplies in order and the exposures in sequence. Someone had to know when a second plate was needed and when the first one was enough. These were small tasks only on paper. In practice, they created a new rhythm for the whole building. That rhythm invited specialization. A service that began as a curious experiment could become a department with its own habits, its own storage, its own schedule, and its own authority. The hospital no longer treated the X-ray room as a borrowed novelty. It treated it as part of the standard path through care. Patients came in, images were made, and the images went on to shape what happened next. More than a new machine, the room had become a way for the hospital to see itself working. Once the room had settled into a routine, another room began to matter just as much. It was quieter, lower, and more ordinary than the exposure space, made of drawers, folders, slips, and shelves. Here the day's work was tied back to names and questions. A plate on its own was only a surface that had been darkened by a ray. A plate with a request slip, a date, and a ward note became part of the hospital's memory. The work began with simple marks: a name, a side, a ward, a complaint written in a steady hand. Perhaps a fracture was suspected. Perhaps a broken piece of metal had to be found. Perhaps a doctor wanted to know whether a shadow in the chest was real or only imagined. The request carried the question into the radiology room, and the reply had to return with enough order to be understood later. Without that order, the image lost much of its value. It could still be interesting, but it could not be trusted in the same way. Trust in the early X-ray room did not come from wonder. It came from habits. The plate had to be matched to the person. The person had to be matched to the chart. The chart had to be matched to the question that brought the plate into being. That chain of connection gave the hospital something stronger than a sudden impression. It gave the hospital a record. The record could be checked. It could be shelved. It could be brought back out when the same problem returned in another week or another body. The drawer was as important as the machine. A wooden cabinet with a row of envelopes or folders did not look dramatic, but it held the department together. One drawer might keep the day's studies. Another might keep older cases that had become useful for teaching. Another might keep images that needed to be compared again with a later plate. The room became a place of return. What entered it did not simply leave. It remained available, waiting for the next question. Some of the work belonged to people who never appeared in the accounts of discovery. A clerk straightened the paper. An attendant carried the plate from one table to another. A doctor wrote a note in the book. A student learned how to sort the cases by the shape of the problem, rather than by the day on which they arrived. This labor was plain, but it was the kind of labor that made the department durable. A new technology could only grow if someone kept track of it. The hospital's pace changed when the images began to collect. A single plate could be looked at once and forgotten. A row of plates could be compared. The same injury could be seen in more than one form. The same kind of trouble could appear in different bodies. What had seemed like a private matter at the bedside became a case with a place in the files. The archive gave medicine a second memory, one that did not depend entirely on the recollection of the doctor who happened to be standing there. Teaching grew out of that memory. A plate that might have helped one patient could also help 10 students. It could be held up, studied, discussed, and returned to the drawer. One case could teach the outline of a fracture. Another could show the edge of a bone in a way no spoken description could match. Another could warn that a shadow had to be read carefully, with patience and comparison, not by excitement alone. The room therefore became a school as well as a service. It trained the eye by giving it repeated chances to look again. That was one of the quiet changes brought by the X-ray. It made teaching more concrete. Instead of describing what could not be seen, a physician could set a plate before a group and let the lesson begin from there. Students did not need to imagine the hidden shape from a sketchy account. They could study the actual result, compare it with the body, and learn how much depended on angle, position, and care. The image did not remove the need for judgment. It refined it. It gave judgment something firmer to keep. The best teaching cases were often the ones that had taken time. A plate that raised doubt, or needed a second look, or fit awkwardly with the patient's symptoms, could become a lesson far beyond the original case. The hospital was learning that uncertainty had value when it was preserved honestly. A poor study, a difficult study, or a study that had to be repeated still had a place in the files if it taught the staff how to do better. The archive did not only keep the successful examples, it kept the rough edges too, That honesty mattered. A room that pretended every image was perfect would not stay trusted for long. Early radiology had limits, and the hospital knew it. An underexposed plate could blur a detail. A careless position could hide the very thing the doctor hoped to find. A missing label could turn a useful image into a problem. By keeping the record honest, the department showed that it understood its own fallibility. That kind of restraint helped more than display. It told the staff and the people outside the room that the machine was a tool, not an oracle. The paper trail also protected meaning. A plate without a name could drift into curiosity. A plate with a name remained a medical document. That difference shaped trust. A patient could accept that an image was made for care when the result sat in a folder with the rest of the chart. The object did not float free from the person. It stayed attached to the reason it had been made. The hospital could point to the file and show that the image belonged to a specific case, with a specific question, handled in a specific order. That order helped the public as much as the staff. Many people knew little about the machine itself. They did not need to understand the tube or the electricity to feel that a hospital was serious if the hospital could retrieve a past plate, compare it with a new one, and explain the difference in plain terms. The image became evidence not because it was mysterious, but because it could be filed and found again. Repetition, not spectacle, built confidence. The more the room behaved like an institution, the more the institution could ask for trust. The new habits changed the path through the building. A request moved from the ward to the desk. The plate moved from the room to the file. The file moved from the cabinet to the teaching table. The teaching table sent the case back to the next doctor, who carried the lesson into another ward or another examination. The hospital was no longer a set of separate chambers that merely happened to share a roof. It had begun to work as a chain. The X-ray room was one link in that chain, and the records room was another. This was why the department gained authority, not because it was loud and not because it was rare, but because it could keep its own work in order. A stack of labeled cases gave the staff something to build on. A teaching file gave the younger doctors a way to learn without guessing. A casebook gave the chief physician a way to remember what had been done and why. Each object was small. Together they made a practice. Together they made a department. Together they made the hospital less dependent on memory alone. The written note mattered as much as the image. Sometimes it mattered more. A plate might show a shape, but the note explained what question had brought the plate into the room. Was the doctor looking for a break, a foreign object, a change in the chest, a problem in the joints, or only a reason to be certain? The answer could not be separated from the question. The records room protected that connection. It kept the inquiry beside the result, where later readers could understand how the image had been used. In that way, teaching and record-keeping served the same purpose. Both asked the hospital to be precise about what it knew and precise about what it did not know. That precision fed public trust. When people saw that the new technology had rules, labels, and a place in the chart, it looked less like a parlor trick and more like medicine. The invisible ray could not be inspected with the hands, but the paper trail around it could be checked by anyone who cared to look closely enough. Some of the strongest confidence came from the ordinary look of the files: a cabinet with drawers, a stack of envelopes, a pen laid beside the ledger, a lamp over the table. These were not grand objects, yet they carried the weight of the department. The hospital was asking the public to believe that what happened in the dark room was real. The answer was not a speech. It was a method. The method had a root, and the root had records, and the records could be shown again. The room also gave the hospital a way to speak across distance. A case that had been useful in one ward could later be useful in another. A doctor who had not been present when the plate was made could still learn from it. A student who had not seen the patient could still study the problem. The image did not need to stay tied to a single bedside once the paperwork had done its work. It could travel through the institution as a lesson. That mobility made the new practice stronger than the moment of exposure. The habit of keeping cases also changed the rhythm of professional life. More questions came back to the department. More students came to the files. More doctors expected an image when they needed certainty. The X-ray room was no longer a curiosity that interrupted the building. It was part of the building's thinking. The records room, in its own quiet way, helped make that possible. It let the institution remember, and by remembering, it let the institution teach. By the end of the day, the drawers held the day in orderly silence. The plates were not forgotten. They were filed, marked, and ready for the next hand that needed them. Somewhere beyond the records room, a student was still thinking about a case. A doctor was still reading a note. A patient was still waiting for an explanation that would make sense. The room's power was not only that it could bring an unseen thing into the open, it was that the result could be kept, taught, compared, and trusted. The records changed the room's purpose without making it less mysterious. A plate came out of the dark room, still smelling faintly of developer, and was slid into an envelope with the patient's name, the date, the ward, and the question that had brought it there. A clerk copied the details into a ledger. Another hand filed the envelope into a drawer that could be opened again when the same body returned with the same pain, or a new doctor wanted to know what had changed. In that small chain of steps, the image stopped being a single event. It became part of the hospital's memory. That memory reached farther than one bedside. On teaching days, a student could stand at the table and see not only the picture, but the discipline behind it. The doctor did not simply point and pronounce, he compared. He held the current plate beside an older one, or beside a similar case from another patient, and made the eye work slowly. A shadow at the edge of a bone, a bright speck in the soft parts, the line of a break, the outline of a swallowed object. Each detail asked for a name, and each name had to be defended by what the plate actually showed. This was one reason the new rooms earned trust. They let the evidence stay in the building long after the lamp was switched off. They let the institution answer questions again, in the same order, with the same visible record. The rhythm of the department grew around that promise. Requests arrived from the wards, from the operating room, from surgeons who wanted a guide before they cut, and from physicians who wanted a check before they guessed. In the corridor, the language of certainty changed. People stopped asking whether the room could see it all, and began asking how quickly it could be ready, who had seen the last plate, and whether the earlier image could be found for comparison. The room became a service, then a habit, then a kind of authority. Its cabinets filled with proof that could be reviewed by another pair of eyes. Its routine made the work less dramatic and more dependable, and that was the deeper change. A public that had once heard about X-rays as a novelty began to meet them as a method. Families saw that the image could explain a fracture, locate a foreign body, or settle a disagreement that hands alone could not settle. Administrators saw that the room produced more than curiosity. It produced records that could be audited, taught from, and returned to when memory failed. Students learned that an image was not the end of thinking, but the beginning of comparison. The hospital learned to speak in plates, numbers, and files, and in speaking that way, it made the new practice harder to dismiss. The X-ray room was no longer only a place where something strange happened once. It was a place where knowledge could be checked, stored, and brought back into the light whenever the next question arrived. After the busiest hours, when the tube cooled and the waiting room emptied, the dark room still had work to do. Plates were washed, dried, labeled, and lined up to be checked against the request slips. A single missing date could send a search through the drawer stack, and so the clerks guarded the order with nearly ceremonial care. The room depended on this care. Its authority came from repetition. Each correctly filed case made the next consultation easier. Each retrieved plate reminded everyone that the hospital had not merely guessed and forgotten. It had observed, kept, and learned. In that way, the X-ray room became part of the institution's reputation. People trusted what could be found again. Beyond the drawer stack, another room carried the same discipline into the night. The ward slip crossed the corridor before it crossed the desk, and the desk crossed it into a smaller chamber where the light was lowered and the surfaces were meant for work rather than display. A plate was selected, a holder checked, and the case entry copied where it could be found again. Night did not make the room dramatic. It made the room exact. That was the point of it. The hospital could hand a question to the X-ray room, and the room could hand back a visible answer that still belonged to the record. The corridors changed after dark, but they did not empty. A porter still rolled a stretcher over the floor. A nurse still carried a folded blanket and the folded request. An elevator, if the building had one, became part of the route between ward and department. The X-ray room sat inside that path. It answered when surgery wanted another look before morning, when a ward needed a picture before a patient could settle, or when a case had become one of those quiet hospital questions that could not wait for daylight. The work moved through the building in the same way water moved through pipes, not seen all at once, but always there. The room itself was spare. A table, a stand, cables, a tube, a chair, a screen, and a cabinet for plates took up nearly all of it. Nothing there was ornamental. The apparatus looked like furniture that had learned another occupation. A curtain, a sheet, or a simple partition might soften the edges of the space, but the central fact was the machine. Some rooms kept a glowing screen close at hand for a quick check of position before the plate was made. Others relied more heavily on the plate itself and the patient's stillness. In every case, the room existed to keep the body in place long enough for a trace to be taken. Just beyond it, or sometimes only a door away, the dark room kept its own discipline. Glass plates arrived in paper sleeves, and each sleeve had to be handled in order. Labels had to be read before the light was reduced. Trays of liquid waited beside a sink, and a drying rack or line stood ready for the plates that had already gone through their first exposure. The work there was quiet in a way that still felt active. Every movement had to preserve the order that the exposure itself depended on. A wet plate did not forgive confusion. A blurred label could make a good image almost useless. A careless hand could waste not only a plate, but a question the hospital was trying to answer. The people around that room did not all come from the same profession. In the early years of X-ray work, physicians, photographers, nurses, engineers, and practical assistants could all be found in the same orbit. The new specialty had not yet settled into a single title with a single training path. That made the night shift more like a workshop than a formal department. One person might position the patient, another might handle the plate, another might keep the ledger, and another might watch the clock that marked how long the room had already borrowed from the ward. The room depended on mixed skill, and that mix was part of its strength. Stillness mattered more than noise. Some exposures were brief enough to feel like a glance. Others took long enough to ask real patience from everyone in the room. A bandaged arm had to stay fixed, a chest had to be held in a known position. A patient who shifted, flinched, or grew tired could spoil the plate and send the whole process back to the beginning. The room taught its staff to speak in short sentences and to wait without making a show of waiting. That was part of ordinary care too. The hospital was full of hard tasks, but this one rewarded restraint. Haste did not make the image clearer, care did. The machine itself required judgment. The tube had to be behaving properly, the distance had to suit the body part, and the aim had to be close enough to useful that the plate would not come out blank or blurred. Early X-ray work lived close to uncertainty, and uncertainty was expensive. A bad plate did not merely waste material. It delayed the next step in the hospital's chain of decisions. The worker at the controls learned to read the equipment by habit, by the tone of the spark, by the feel of the room, by the patient position, and by the image that returned after development. No single glance settled the matter. The whole setup had to be judged together, again and again. When the image did fail, the failure was rarely dramatic. It was usually ordinary. A label had slipped, a hand had moved, a holder had been set down at the wrong angle, a request had been copied imperfectly. Those small mistakes mattered because the room was part of a larger institution that ran on continuity. The same case might come back the next day. Another physician might read the plate later. A ward might ask for comparison against a previous image. The room had to be accurate enough that its work could be found again and trusted later. A picture without a traceable paper trail was not much help to anyone who had to make a decision. That was why the request slip and the plate belonged together so tightly. The paper was not a side note, it was the bridge between the hospital's questions and the room's answer. At night, when fewer hands were available, the bridge had to be even sturdier. The clerk at the desk, the attendant in the darkroom, and the operator at the table all depended on the same plain things: dates, names, room numbers, and a steady sequence of entries in the book. The hospital did not trust a picture that could not be matched to a case. It trusted a picture that could be returned to the case, the ward, and the patient's chart without confusion. The cases themselves were rarely theatrical. The rooms served broken limbs, surgical questions, unexplained pain, and the small unknowns that fill a hospital's day. It was useful because it could look where the eye could not. A fragment of metal, a puzzling swelling, a bone that did not seem quite right, a chest that needed another look before a decision was made. These were the kinds of questions that sent people down the corridor after hours. The work was practical before it was famous. Most of it happened without applause, and most of it was simply called being ready. The hospital did not always need a miracle. Sometimes it needed a clear plate, correctly labeled and filed before morning. Night made that readiness more visible. By then, the day staff had thinned out. The wards had settled into a different rhythm. The X-ray room did not sleep, but it did narrow its attention. One patient at a time, one plate at a time, one label at a time. The corridor outside could seem almost empty, yet the department still moved from case to case with the measured pace of a place that expected interruption. In that sense, the night shift was not an exception. It was the clearest version of the room's everyday life. Its work became more visible after dark because there were fewer other things to hide it. The path back from the room mattered too. After the exposure, the patient did not remain there. The plate moved into the darkroom. The result moved toward the register, the envelope, the shelf, or the file cabinet. The answer was not complete until someone else could read it. That is one reason the department became part of the hospital's memory. The work left behind a physical trace that could be held, compared, and consulted again. A case that was once uncertain could become part of the institution's record. The next person to open the file did not start from nothing. The room had already done its part, and the record preserved it. That record changed the feeling of the place. A room that produces only a fleeting image is a curiosity. A room that produces an image and stores it becomes a service. It becomes a habit. Staff learn where to look for the earlier plate. Surgeons learn that the picture might still be there when they need it. Ward nurses learn that the answer may travel back to them not as a rumor, but as a marked object with a date on it. The ordinary power of the X-ray room was not that it saw once, it was that it could be found again. That repeatability gave the room a standing inside the hospital that no display case could have given it. After each case, there was still cleaning to do. Tables were wiped, plates were sorted, the wash basin was used, the towel was changed, the floor was checked for dust or spills. Supports were returned to their place. Blank envelopes were stacked in order. The room had to be reset so completely that the next call could enter without friction. This sort of care is easy to overlook because it leaves no dramatic trace, but the room depended on it more than on any single exposure. Night shift was in part a sequence of resets. A finished plate did not end the work, it simply made room for the next one. Because the work was repetitive, it also became disciplined. The staff learned to look twice. They learned to move around one another without crowding. They learned not to waste words. A patient in the room could feel that order, even if no one explained it. The calm did not come from stillness alone. It came from preparation. The table was ready. The plate was ready. The labels were ready. The ward knew someone would answer the call. That assurance, repeated over and over, was one of the quiet achievements of early radiology. The room did not depend on one dramatic success. It depended on many correct small motions, repeated until they became trustworthy. The hospital at night was full of other labor too, and the X-ray room sat among those older tasks without trying to replace them. The laundry still worked. The kitchen still sent food when it had to. The pharmacy still measured and stored what it kept. The records office still matched paper to person. The new room joined that system rather than floating above it. It changed the way the hospital moved through uncertainty, but it still had to fit into the building's older habits of carrying, filing, cleaning, and returning. That is part of why it endured. It could be used by a busy institution without demanding that the institution become something else. The room also showed how wide the new practice had become. It was not carried by a single kind of worker. It was shared among hands that cleaned, hands that held, hands that wrote, hands that developed, and hands that pointed the tube into place. The hospital of the early X-ray room was still learning how to divide that labor, but it already understood that the room needed all of it. No single action made the image. The image came from the entire chain, from the slip to the plate to the ledger to the shelf. The chain was the care. Without it, the picture was only a brief event. With it, the picture became part of the hospital's practical intelligence. As the hours passed, the night shift made the department look less like an experiment and more like a service. The first years after the discovery had been full of quick curiosity, borrowed equipment, and improvised arrangements. But in the hospital, the new work had already begun to settle into repeated use. A room near surgery, or near the dispensary, became a place people could ask for by habit. A dark room became a place where plates could be trusted to return as records. A desk became a place where the day's uncertainty could be turned into something the next shift might still find. The machine remained special in one sense, but the room around it had become ordinary enough to be relied upon. The people working there learned a kind of patience that did not announce itself. They waited for the patient to settle. They waited for the plate to take. They waited for the image to emerge in the darkroom. They waited for the clerk to enter the result in the book and tuck the envelope where it belonged. Night work asked for that patience, and the hospital depended on it. No single moment made the room valuable. Its value came from keeping the sequence intact when the building was tired and the corridors were quiet. That is often how institutions survive their own inventions. They make room for them, then make them repeatable. Toward morning, the rhythm changed again. The early shift would soon need the same shelves, the same desk, the same table, the same careful filing. Nothing in the room could be left half done. A plate already hung in the record, a label already matched to a case, a holder already put back in place, a basin already rinsed and drying. All of it had to greet the next worker without confusion. The night shift ended, not with ceremony, but with readiness passed on. That was the ordinary care the room practiced best. It did not merely make images, it kept them in order long enough for the hospital to use them. The drawer under the reading desk held more than plates. It held the habit that stayed. Once the room had done its work, the important thing was not the brief flare of discovery, but the route that carried the result onward, into a folder, into a chart, into a ward, into another set of hands, and finally back again when someone needed to compare. That small route became part of modern medicine. The first X-ray rooms did not remain as curiosities or demonstrations. They taught hospitals how to keep an image long enough to use it, how to make a moment of seeing last beyond the moment itself, and how to let a record outlive the light that made it. That lesson was larger than any single machine. A hospital had always kept notes, But the X-ray added a new kind of note, one made of shadow and density, something that could be seen by one person and checked by another. A plate could be labeled, compared, and brought back out when the same question returned weeks or months later. The room gave the hospital a memory that could be handled. It was not enough to look once. The result had to survive the walk to another room, the delay before reading, the turn of a page, the next consultation, and the ordinary forgetfulness that came with busy days. A record that could not be found again was no record at all. The ordinary objects mattered: a shelf, a drawer, a register, a label, a window shade, a request slip with an edge worn soft by handling, a pencil that stayed sharp because someone kept it that way, a folder stack that had to be left in exact order before the shift changed. None of those things carried the drama of discovery, but each one made the discovery usable. The image did not finish in the moment it was made. It had to live long enough to be read again, and then live again in the records that followed. That is why the first rooms mattered to modern medicine, even after the novelty faded. They made proof durable. That durability reached beyond the room itself. The X-ray created a bridge between bedside and archive, between the quick concern of the ward and the slower judgment of the desk. A request left one part of the hospital and returned as a result that could be compared with a chart, a note, or an older image. The bridge changed how the hospital thought about time. A case was no longer only what happened in the morning. It became something that could be revisited in the afternoon, the next day, or a later admission. The picture outlived the immediate visit, and that changed the rhythm of care. The hospital was learning to keep sight and memory tied together. That is why the X-ray room lasted after newer ways of seeing arrived. Medicine did not move from one invention to a final answer. It accumulated methods, each one adding another kind of sight. Ultrasound entered medical use in 1942. Nuclear magnetic resonance followed in 1952. PET came in 1973. Computed tomography arrived in 1979. Magnetic resonance imaging followed in 2003, after the older name nuclear magnetic resonance was set aside because the word nuclear carried the wrong association for many listeners. The timeline changed, but the promise stayed familiar: make something hidden visible enough to think about, compare, and store. The newer methods widened the field, but they did not erase the older discipline. Even the names had to be managed with care. A new method could be scientifically sound and still need a gentler public face. The hospital had to speak clearly about what it used, and the language around the images became part of that work. The old X-ray room had already taught this lesson. Proof did not speak for itself. It needed labels, explanations, and a place in the record. It needed a path from the machine to the person who would use it, and a way to travel through the hospital without losing its meaning along the way. Words were not decoration. They were part of the machinery of trust. Röntgen's discovery in 1895 gave that shift its first shape, and the first Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901 gave it public weight. The discovery did not stay in the laboratory. It moved into hospitals, where the work of looking inside the body could be organized, repeated, and taught. That move mattered as much as the discovery itself. A room that had once felt experimental grew familiar. Its routines hardened into hospital culture. The machine could be replaced, refined, or joined by another method, but the habit of making a hidden body legible to the institution remained. It was not just a scientific breakthrough. It became part of the daily order of medicine. The people around the room were part of the inheritance too. Some handled the plates, some wrote the labels, some brought the requests, some compared the new image with the old one, some checked the order of names, some kept the folder stack in shape so nothing got mixed. The work was never a single hand doing a single act. It was a chain of careful steps, each one small enough to seem ordinary and important enough to keep the next step from going wrong. In that chain, modern medicine found one of its lasting habits: collaboration that was quiet, procedural, and exact. Every person touched the same record, even if each person touched only one part of it. That change reached beyond the room itself. A hospital with X-rays could no longer depend only on memory or a quick bedside impression. It had to keep an image beside the note beside the request beside the patient list, and the list beside the folder where the older record waited. The hospital became an archive as well as a place of treatment. Drawers, folders, casebooks, and file rooms gained new importance. A plate from last week might matter more than a fresh guess. Comparison became part of judgment, and judgment became slower, steadier, and more accountable because it had something to return to. The chart and the image began to stand side by side. Teaching changed with it. A plate no longer belonged only to the case that produced it. It could be shown again in a lesson, stored with other examples, and used to train a steadier eye. A drawer of old images became a classroom in its own right. Staff learned to compare shape with shape, shadow with shadow, note with note, and to see how one image answered a question while another one raised a different one. That habit of comparison survived into modern departments, where records are reviewed, images are matched, and earlier findings are never quite finished with. The room taught the hospital to learn from what it had already seen, instead of treating every case as if it began from nothing. The first X-ray rooms also taught medicine how to keep a place for uncertainty. An image did not erase every question. It made some things clearer and left others untouched. That was not a failure. It was part of the discipline. The body could now be studied in a more direct way, but it still asked to be interpreted with care. Sometimes the clearest picture only sharpened the question instead of ending it. Modern medicine still works with methods that reveal different layers of the same body, each one good for a different kind of question. The old room did not pretend to be complete. It stood at the beginning of a larger map, one that later generations filled in with other instruments and other rooms. That exactness was never cold. It had its own patience. A plate had to be exposed, carried, read, stored, and guarded against confusion. A request had to travel the right route and come back answered. A room had to be ready for the next case without losing the order already made. The first X-ray rooms left behind a model of service in which the day was measured by readiness and return. Modern medicine still shows that model whenever a result moves from one hand to another without losing its meaning, and whenever the hospital keeps a place for the thing that was seen. The work was quiet, but it was never casual. The old room's language survived in subtler ways too. Hospitals still depend on controlled spaces, stable procedures, and records that can be checked against one another. They still depend on the person who knows where the file belongs, on the person who can find the earlier image, on the person who can tell which note goes with which case. The technology changes, but the structure of responsibility remains. One of the deepest inheritances from the first X-ray rooms was that care could be organized around exactness, not haste, not spectacle, exactness. That simple discipline made the new way of seeing fit inside the older work of the hospital. That discipline helped turn novelty into routine. The first rooms were strange enough to draw attention, but the daily hospital had to make room for them beside the laundry, the linen, the wards, the charts, and the other practical things that kept a building alive. Once the room became ordinary, it became more useful. It no longer needed to announce itself, it only needed to be ready. A result could be passed along, filed, and found again without ceremony. The habit of quiet efficiency became part of the building's character, and that character remained long after the first wonder had passed. The room settled into the work around it. When later imaging methods arrived, they did not cancel that older discipline. Ultrasound, nuclear magnetic resonance, PET, computed tomography, and MRI expanded the hospital's range, but each one still needed its own room, its own naming, its own record, its own readers. The older X-ray practice remained because it had taught something basic and durable. Seeing inside the body was not only a technical feat, it was an administrative, human, And moral practice too. It asked that evidence be clear, that records be kept, and that the chain of care not be broken when one eye gave way to another. Each new method carried the same burden in a different form. That chain of care depended on trust, and trust grew from repetition. Families and staff had to learn what it meant to see inside the body without opening it. The image could seem marvelous, even unsettling, until the routine around it made it ordinary. Once ordinary, it became easier to believe. The filing of a plate, the naming of a case, the return of a record to its shelf, all of that turned novelty into reliability. Modern medicine still depends on that same transformation. A result must feel both new and dependable before it can settle into practice and become part of the daily work. What was once astonishing had to become usable. Public language mattered here as well. The phrase nuclear magnetic resonance carried a different burden than the shorter name MRI, and the change was more than cosmetic. It showed how carefully medicine had to manage the words that surrounded its tools. A name could help an audience understand, or it could send the mind somewhere else. The history of imaging, therefore, included not only machines and rooms, but also the public language around them. The X-ray room had already taught that lesson too. A plate could not explain itself. Someone had to write its name correctly, place it correctly, and keep its meaning clear. The record had to make the picture legible. The hospital's memory became more layered because of it. Old images could be kept beside new ones, and that gave medicine a way to notice change rather than guess at it. A familiar outline could be checked against a later one. A note could be compared with the folder that came before it. A room could answer a question once, then answer another question later in a different form. That habit of returning to earlier records shaped modern practice in ways that went beyond one department. It made the hospital a place where the past stayed reachable, not as sentiment, but as evidence. The file did not close on a case so much as keep it ready. The first X-ray room also left behind a rhythm of work that fit the rest of the building. The corridor outside could be noisy, the ward could be crowded, and the desk could be full of papers, but the room still asked for order before speed. That rhythm remained in modern medicine whenever a report waited for the right reader, whenever a folder returned to its slot, whenever a case was discussed with the older image nearby. It was a kind of hospitality toward evidence. The hospital made a place for what it had seen, so that it would not be lost in the rush of the next task. The room's quiet shaped the larger house. The room's physical shape mattered less over time than the habits it taught, but the shape still left a trace. Modern medicine kept the idea of a dedicated place where information could be made, checked, and stored with care. That could be a radiology suite, a reading room, a file room, or any other space where the hospital slowed down enough to make the record trustworthy. The first X-ray rooms showed that such places were not luxuries. They were part of the hospital's thinking, part of how knowledge moved from one hand to another without breaking apart. The room became part of the map of care. So what remained in modern medicine was not only a machine or a single kind of image. What remained was the room's discipline, a place for the request, a place for the result, a place for the file, a place for the next pair of eyes. The first X-ray rooms passed that discipline forward until it became part of the hospital itself. Their legacy lived in folders, in shelves, in reading rooms, in the careful return of every record to its place. The room did not disappear. It settled into the routines that followed it, and medicine kept going with that quiet order still inside it. That was the inheritance. And near the end of the night, the room returned to its simplest form. The table stood clear, the cabinets were closed, and the last plate rested where morning hands could find it. The machine itself was quiet again, yet the order around it remained awake. Request beside result, older image beside newer image, each object kept in the place that gave it meaning. This was how a startling invention became a dependable part of care, not through spectacle, but through patient repetition, not through one brilliant moment, But through thousands of small, careful returns, the X-ray room taught the hospital to hold what it had seen, to compare one day with another, and to pass knowledge forward without hurry. Long after the lamps dimmed and the corridor softened into morning, that habit stayed. A hidden structure had become visible, and the hospital had learned how to remember it. In the hush before the next shift arrived, the room seemed almost empty, but its shelves, drawers, and carefully ordered plates held the quiet promise that tomorrow's question would not have to begin alone.